So in this episode, we're going to think a bit about why people commit sexual offences, because I think generally this is the hardest thing for people to understand, why people would do that. And over the years, people have seen people that commit sexual offences as more extremely dangerous than people who commit, for instance, an armed robbery or even a murder. And so we try to think about why people might commit those offences. And what we found is that actually it's very complex, and each individual will have done it for different reasons. But over the years of research that's been done, we've seen sort of patterns as to why people might do that.
It's really interesting. I was thinking, Jerry, that there's something really emotive about sexual offences, and equally about offences committed perhaps in the home, or offences that are committed to somebody you love or somebody in a kind of intimate way. I always think sexual offending is almost something closer to people that people would see as rather than a offence committed with a weapon or down on this, a fight in a pub or.
No, that's true. And I think people often differentiate between that, but actually Freud would probably say if you stab somebody, you're actually still penetrating. So yeah, so somebody who commits, for instance, stabbing is still penetrating somebody in a different way and sometimes in a different place on their body, but it still can be seen and to understand. So if, for instance, somebody murdered somebody and stabbed them in particular areas of their body, that might be seen as a sexual offence or have sexual parts to it because of where they've stabbed them in their body. So I think people do generally think a sexual offence, very often the stereotype of a sexual offence is somebody jumping out of a bush at night onto a stranger, and actually we know most sexual offences are committed by people we know, and so that's a stereotype, but it's often not actually borne out in reality. So people that are convicted of sexual offences will often find it really shameful to talk about what they've done and not view themselves in that way. So they'll often think, oh no, I'm not that person, but not see what they've done as being in the same category.
And I was also thinking of how broad sexual offending really is. And I think sometimes, depending on the type of sexual offence, that can be harder for people to understand. So I kind of think, similar to Laura, I think it does really tap into our emotions, into our moral compass, more so sometimes than other offences. But even within the sexual offence, there's categories, if you like. There are lots of different types of offences that I think can be harder to understand and harder to tolerate.
And the type of person, I mean, with you, Kate, when you're working with adolescents, or I've worked with juveniles, people in the 15 to 18 age bracket, or females or males, all the different ways people assume why someone might commit offence can be quite different. Although there's always a other side to that where they can be quite similar. If you think there's some research out there that talks about the similarities between somebody that might decide to burgle a house and someone that might decide to commit an offence. And when they looked at the different types of people who had committed those offences, they found very similar traits, very similar beliefs, very similar reasons to why someone might do that. And I remember someone saying to me, would a burglary be almost the rape of a house? In some ways it's still that intimate intrusion. And so how do you look at something like that? I mean, how do you separate people but also see that they can be quite similar?
And that's a really good point, because I think the statistically people that commit sexual offences are less likely to reoffend, but I think generally people think they're more likely to and they're more risky. So I think people do generally have that belief about people who've committed sexual offences. And likewise, young people that commit sexual offences are less likely to reoffend. And people, for instance, who commit offences via the internet are a very different sort of group of people in lots of ways. So they haven't committed a contact offence with somebody, but they've done it from a distance. And that can be a very different sort of reason for doing that than there would be for going out and forcing somebody to have sex with you in a different way. So people who, for instance, commit offences via the internet can often have very different beliefs about what they're doing and not see themselves as committing offending at all, because they feel that they're just looking at something that's already there, for instance. And so and that group are often at very high risk of very shamed when they're arrested and caught, and they're very high risk, for instance, of committing suicide. And so they are a different group of people in some ways. In some ways they might carry on and then commit a contact offence and then put themselves in a different category, but people are different. So looking at all of those, for instance, females who commit sexual offences, again, are very different, and their reasons for committing sexual offences can be quite different. Well, there's often a belief that people who've committed sexual offences do so because they've been sexually abused themselves, and that's an interesting correlation. They're not necessarily that somebody, so the majority of people who are sexually abused don't go on and commit sexual offences. So in a way, those are the people you'd want to look at, but you don't get the opportunity to do that. And so the majority of people who are sexually abused are females, and yet they're the minority of people that commit sexual offences. So that is a bit of a red herring in terms of why people do it. But I think
if you think about, Jerry, that's an interesting point as well, because I think there's lots in the literature. If you look around, just taking bullying as an example, there's lots in the literature that says somebody that perhaps gets bullied as a child, either by adults or by peers, then can sometimes go on and identify with that sort of more aggressive side as a way of protecting themselves. And almost feeling as if they are, they need to go out and be the aggressor. Sometimes that's been almost put out there as one of those ideas of why would people tend to be more aggressive rather than work through what's happened to them and recover, which lots of people, do go on and survive this.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you do get a group of people that really identify with going on to be the aggressor.
Yeah, and I think that is more likely that a male would do that than a female. So females would tend to show their distress by self-harming or eating disorders. This is generalisation because both will do the same, but the majority would have anxiety disorders, and they were more likely to go and ask for help. Whereas, as you say, men who've been abused, they tend to identify with the person who's abusive to them and try to be like them and be more powerful, and so they tend to be more aggressive. And so then that aggressiveness comes out, and they might end up committing a murder or committing another aggressive offence rather than another sexual offence. Each person does have a different reason, a different path into the offence and a different path out. So it is hard to generalise, but I guess as psychologists we tend to look at statistically what have the majority of people done in these situations to try and help us to start breaking things down a bit as to what we would do to help the person in the future.
I have just started working on a wing that's specifically for people that have committed sexual offences. So I'm really looking forward to kind of developing my skills and thinking a bit more about how I can help these men on the wing. One thing that I am really struck by is the men that have committed sexual offences, how they interact and they communicate is very different to people that have committed violent offences. And I haven't quite yet put my finger on how I would describe that, but that is something that I think is a really big difference in how they interact with other people, with themselves. I guess being a young female member of staff, that's also going to be an element of added, another layer. But yeah, I was thinking about kind of like society, how we treat people who have committed sexual offences and what effect that has on how then these men or women who then go back outside, how they're going to interact with society.
And that's really important, Emily, having worked in several prisons on the wing where it is people with sexual convictions, it tends to be much less alarm bells, there's less acting out aggressively in the prison as there is outside. So they do respond differently in prison. Thinking, going back to the reasons, so if somebody, for instance, has been sexually abused, and so ideally if somebody gets sexually abused, they would tell somebody, that person would support them and help them and get them out of that situation, and it wouldn't happen again. But sometimes we know the abuse can go on for a long time. They don't tell people. If they do, for instance, tell somebody and that person doesn't believe them, that's going to affect how they view themselves, how they view what's happening to them. And so it's a whole different pathway from them onwards. And so the person who's committing the abuse might be saying things to them. For instance, if you tell anybody, your family's going to be split up, you're going to go, your mum or your dad or somebody is going to go to prison, you're going to be taken away from your family. So as a child, that's a very powerful message. And so they might find it very difficult, understandably then, to go on and report it. And in the general media, you often hear when a person comes forward many years later and reports something, people say, well, I don't believe it because they didn't report it at the time. But if you remember yourself being a child, the things that might have happened to you that you might not have gone and told anybody for a number of reasons. So our childlike way of thinking is quite different to how we think of as adults. And so I do think it's learning those sorts of intricacies of why we respond the way we do to what happens to us. So if somebody goes on for over a period of time and is sexually abused by somebody who's in a powerful position to them, it might be a family member or a neighbour, they might find it difficult to tell their mum, for instance, that the mum's best friend has been abusing them. They would find that a very difficult thing to do. And so there's a number of reasons people don't report it when it happens and don't report it till years later. Some of the high profile offences that have come to light recently, again, by sort of famous people, people don't report them at the time, by Jimmy Savile, because who would believe you if you said Jimmy Savile had done that to you? Because his perception, everybody's perception of him was, he's a great person, a saint almost in what he did. And so people didn't come forward and report it for good reason at that time, but they felt safe to do it later when somebody else came forward.
And I was really thinking about what you were saying, Jerry, and what Emily was saying, and about relationships, and the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. And I was thinking about the attachment model and thinking about some of the reasons why someone might offend. So thinking about contact offences in particular, and perhaps intrafamilial offending or offending that happens within some sort of attachment relationship. Actually, the function of the offending is very similar to the attachments that we seek in other people. So some of the functions and the needs that we meet through our attachments with other people are about closeness, about proximity, about safety, and actually some of the needs that are met through some of those contact offending are actually really similar. And so just thinking about actually the importance of and the role of the relationship and attachments in terms of thinking about the function of some of the offending.
What would stop? So say you have two people that have poor attachment and have been sexually abused throughout their childhood. Like, what would differentiate somebody from going on to commit a sexual offence as opposed to a violent offence?
And that's a really great question, but I think it depends on the individual. And as Laura says, sometimes a person has had a long history of committing burglaries and then go into a house where there's a woman and it becomes a sexual offence, because almost in an opportunistic way, in that way. But then when they start to understand themselves a bit better, they might think, actually, I understand now that I was fantasizing that might happen at some stage. Before that happened, they had thought about it, because for somebody else walking into that position, they might see a woman and think, oh, I thought the house was empty, and just walk straight out again. But so there's something different in those two ways people respond. And I guess with the person, I think a lot is how people respond when they tell somebody that's happened, and the support they get, or if they don't tell anybody, how they view themselves that's happened to them.
I mean, one of the things that's been quite current, I think, in risk assessment is also this idea about sexual interest. And maybe I think, Jerry, you're probably one of the people that, writes books on these things. So I think that's something people would be interested in. If somebody has a really strong interest in a particular sexual way, does that mean that they would go on and commit a sexual offence?
And that's a fascinating subject as well. I mean, there's some really good books on this subject. For instance, there's a book by Brett Carr which is called Sex and the Psyche, and he talks about having conducted a massive piece of research with people, just general public, people that have gone into therapy or people that have just filled in surveys, and the extreme, sometimes we might see sexual interest they have, and yet they haven't gone on to offend as far as we know. And so people have really diverse sexual interests, and how they've developed them is a whole different topic. But they could have all these sexual interests but not ever dream of taking that next step. So some of the early sort of theories about why people commit or how they go on to commit sexual offences is that they, one, have to have a sexual interest in doing that, but then they also have to have a way of overcoming their inhibitions, because most people, we might all often think about things we might do, but we have a sort of a filter that says to us, so you can't do that for whatever reason. So to go on and commit a sexual offence, you have to first of all have the interest in doing it, but also be able to somehow overcome your disinhibitors of doing that. And then you also have to have the opportunity to commit an offence, and you also have to somehow overcome the victim's resistance. So there's a number of steps. So whereas often a man will say to us when we've worked with them, it just happened, when they go back and look, actually they realise there were a number of steps that they had to overcome in able to do that. And I guess linking to what Kate said about attachment, if you've got a very sort of clear family around you and relationships, you're less likely to go and to do that than if somebody who hasn't got those relationships and doesn't feel that they've got anything to lose in some ways, that they could see the other person just as an object for their pleasure. So somebody might think, for instance, they might have beliefs about women, that women say no, but actually they mean yes, and they just need a bit of persuading. A common thing when people are having sexual offences committed against them is that they don't respond. They don't say no or stop or any of those things. And what we know from how our systems work, if we're in shock, if something shocking happens to us, we could either fight against it, or we try and get away, or we could freeze. And a lot of people, when they have a shocking thing happen to them, for instance a sexual offence, will freeze, but the person committing the offence will take that as they're not stopping me. So the person who's been the victim afterwards could feel really bad about themselves that they didn't stop it. But it is a natural inborn part of our brain. The way the brain works is to play dead, because in nature that's a good way. If somebody's attacking you and you play dead, they'll think you're dead, they'll stop, because they'll think that you're no longer a threat to them. And so people, it's a very primal sort of part of the brain, that your brain responds that way and you freeze. And then that's seen by yourself, if you were the victim in one way, and by the perpetrator in a different way, when actually it's just a very basic primitive response to the system you're in, or the shock that's happening to you. The subject of men who commit indecent exposure and expose themselves is fascinating. Again, it's a whole different group of men who do that, and women. So some women will do that as well. But men, for instance, will often, the response to having that happen to you, that's happened to me a number of times in my life, and I've often wondered about that, why it's happened to me, and why is that any link to why I've gone in to do this job. But my response has always been, even now when it happened as an adult, is to laugh, because I think shock, and it's a sort of shock is unexpected, and it's and I've always laughed when it's happened. I say always, I mean it's happened 4 times to me, but I've worked with a man who was a prolific self-exposer, and he just could not stop himself doing it. But he said the women always laugh, they always enjoy it, they like it, they're pleased it's happening, and he really felt in this distorted belief of his was that they were happy about it. And of course he didn't see them 5 minutes later when the shock was wearing off, and they realised, and they started to panic themselves, and they start to think what might have happened. Because unfortunately, again, the way our brains work is when we get past the shock, we don't just think, oh, that's good, and relax. We start to think that could have been much worse. And so the victim of that being exposed to could well go away and start to think all sorts of things, or they might just think that was funny and not have another thought for it. And again, depending on the circumstances of that happening, who they're with, what happened afterwards, could make a big difference to the victim in that position. So this particular person was very tragic in lots of ways. He used to get very short sentences, and so he would then go into prison for a few months at a time, go back out again, and could never really understand himself why he was doing it. But he was never in prison long enough to get onto a program, because the program was 6 months long. And he eventually asked me, when he came into prison again, and he just turned 40, he said, can you come to the court with me and give evidence and say I need a longer sentence, because I want to do the program you're offering, to try and understand why I keep doing this. I want to stop, but I can't stop myself. And sadly, in that case, the reason he'd got a longer sentence was the person who had he'd exposed himself stepped back out away from him, which is again a natural response. She stepped away from him, but she stepped out into the road, and so was narrowly escaped being run over by a car. So that could have been a whole different outcome for him and for her, but luckily she wasn't. But it became more serious because of the way she reacted in a very natural way of getting away from him. So he tried, and he eventually the judge agreed with that, and because the actions were more serious, he felt that it was the right thing to do to give him a longer sentence. But sadly, it didn't stop him, and he went on. And I only asked a couple of years ago, I asked somebody who'd also worked with him, do you know what happened to him? And sadly, he committed suicide. So he'd never been able to stop himself offending. And he did feel he was so torn in what he was doing. And I don't know why he committed suicide, but whether that was something to do with it, I don't know. But that was 4 or 5 years later. And so you just don't know. It's not a straightforward thing where somebody's doing it, the person exposes themselves, the victim laughs, he laughs, and they go away. It's never that simple. It's a very complex reason why he would be doing that.
And I think with the people we've worked with in prison, and maybe again speaking a bit generalised, there's always somebody that bucks a trend. If you always think, yeah, we can understand why people might commit, a rape, or they might go and commit an internet offence, or they might commit offence against sexual offence against a family member. You always think, yeah, we've got this, we understand it. And then somebody comes along and gives a completely other different slant on it. So it's quite hard sometimes to always say, it's for this reason or that reason. I think there's always such individual factors. And I think this is something forensic psychology are really getting onto, this idea that it's not just within the person, it's outside of the person. It's not what's happened to the person around them. It's also their relationships with others. And it's not as simple as, somebody takes drugs and goes off and commits that sort of offence. There's always, something about the environment, something about their culture, something about that particular time in their life, something that, a life event. There's always such different influences, so many variables to sort of almost pull together and think, oh, okay, that's why that person did that. But that would be entirely different to perhaps the next person. And I think that makes our job quite interesting, because you're always trying to think, how can we help this person think about not going out and doing it again? What harm have they done? How can they look at that? How can they see what protects them? How can they see what led up to it? It's not really the details of the offence that's the most important bit. It's almost this build up to it. And then how can you help people create a sort of safety net around them?
And I was also thinking about, so a lot of the guys I work with been involved in gangs, and there is some emerging evidence to suggest that there is quite a rape culture within some gangs, and that part of the initiation for some people getting involved in gangs is to go out and commit a sexual offence. And so I was thinking about the role of peer pressure actually, and the role of the environment and the culture that they grow up in, and how that normalizes that it's okay to go out and do that to somebody else. So kind of feeding in with what Laura was saying, I think, and moving away from the sexual deviance aspect of sexual offending, there is also the role of the environment and how some of those behaviours gets normalised. And also some of the other guys I know who've committed sexual offences did it as part of a group, and felt peer pressure in order to commit an offence. So I think it is very multifaceted, and it isn't, I don't think we've got one model that applies to everyone in equal measure. There might be some bits of certain theories that fits for one person, and then there might be a different function for somebody else. And I think it's looking at all of them and seeing how what's relevant for this person. And I guess in order to try and make sure that actually we try and prevent that happening again in the future.
Kate, those people that you've worked with who have committed a rape as part of a gang, are they more accepted in the prison environment than those that perhaps haven't been as involved in a gang?
That's a really interesting question actually. I think there still is a lot of shame around it, and a lot of them won't own that. So a lot of them won't even acknowledge that, in spite of it being on their file, but that they won't kind of openly acknowledge that. They'll just kind of align themselves with the violent offender category. I don't like using that term, but that kind of category of offending rather than having committed a sexual offence. But I also think it feeds into a wider cultural view on, you know, the point that Jerry was making about rape myths, and about how society views an entitlement to sex. So I think it kind of falls from some of that, actually. And so then I think if you've committed an offence under that sort of bracket versus an offence towards a child, say, I think they are viewed very, very differently, and there absolutely is a hierarchy of offences. But certainly for some of the guys I work with, they're not quite ready to own that or take responsibility for that just yet.
I was reading an article recently about how this idea of perversion, although that word isn't pleasant to use anymore, but how it has changed over time, in that what we once deemed was inappropriate, such as homosexuality, now isn't, and as time moves on, actually how we view what would be abhorrent or an offence to commit, actually, as our times are changing, our knowledge and understanding of what is illegal and not is also changing.
And I was thinking about upskirting having become illegal quite recently, which is, you know, really shift in the positive direction. But actually, when you think about the culture that surrounded that for years, and a culture of silence, a culture of minimising, a culture of acceptance, and I think we do need to look at how and in what way some of those might influence someone's sexual scripts, someone perhaps justifying some of their own behaviours to a certain extent for some offending.
Yeah, I mean, I worked with a man, so that must probably 16 years ago now, who'd been convicted of that offence. Amongst other things, that's what he'd also done. But he'd done it in a museum, somewhere like the British History Museum or some very public place. And so the people he'd taken the photos of didn't even necessarily know it had happened. So he was standing at the bottom of the stairs and taking these photos. And when we were saying to him about the impact on the victim, he said, well, they weren't victims until somebody told them that they'd had it done to them. They didn't know, so they weren't victims. So it was basically saying it was the police's fault for going and telling them, otherwise they weren't affected because they didn't know about it. So it's interesting how people look at what they're doing and whether they are hurting the other person. And that can often be the case with people that commit offences via the internet, because they say, well, those images are already there. I haven't created those images. I've just looked at images that are already there. But during the time I worked with people on the programme looking at that, we looked at trying to understand, well, how do we get people that committed offences via the internet to understand, you know, how their victims have been affected. And one of the victims that came to light, which is not an obvious victim, was the police in this instance, because the police have to look at the most disturbing images. One man I worked with was due to have a release on temporary license, so he was going out for a day as a way of preparing for his release. And so the police were spoken to say this was going to happen, and this policeman said that was 15 years ago he committed those offences, and yet that set of the offences are still one of the most requested. And this police officer was so affected by this case even that many years later, because he said there's hardly anybody that we arrest and look at their computer, they don't have some of that offence on their computer. And so again, he's an indirect victim, but certainly is a victim of what's happening, because as part of his job he had seen horrific images that he would never have seen in any other way. And so they are people that we as forensic psychologists might work with in a different way, and offering them support to deal with that, and thinking about how they would manage that material.
I was thinking about that real question of why is it important to understand why people commit offences. I suppose some people might think, well, they've done it, they should just be in prison forever, and that will be that. And I think the reality is that these people are going to be coming out, they are going to be in the public, that, you know, they do need to be managed, they do need support to help them, you know, stop going on and offending again. And I suppose this whole reason of trying to make sense of why someone commits a sexual offence is almost helping them understand, you know, if we can make some sense of it, then hopefully they make some sense of it, and hopefully that's where the protective elements come into it.
And I was kind of thinking about what you were saying, Laura, and I was thinking about the public cost of not understanding it. And I think, you know, we can, in some ways, we can kind of bury our heads in the sand and lock them up and, you know, put people behind bars and forget about it. But the public cost of offending on the victims, on the economy, on society is massive. So you think of the financial cost, the psychological impact of that. And I think our hope for this channel was that we would try and help towards, in some small way, trying to understand this a little bit more, so we can the society can put things in place perhaps in trying to help people move away from these sorts of choices that they make. And in order to do that, we need to truly understand what puts the person in that position in the first place, and what also shapes their thinking and behavior at the time that allows them to do that to somebody else. So I think that that's another important element to kind of think about, is what is the cost of not understanding it to the victims, to society, and also to the perpetrators as well.
So thank you all for watching, and leaves us one thing left to say. Let's talk forensic psychology.